All right. Good noon, everybody. Welcome back to Self-Righteous Blood, our study of the book of Judges. Took a week off last week, but we are right back into it. And unfortunately, we're not into the good stuff when it comes to Judges. We are in what we have called the armpit of the Bible. Some people call it the sewer of the Bible. The point is, the stuff we're reading at the end of the book of Judges, it is not pretty stuff at all. Last time we got into Judges chapter 18 as well as chapter 17, and that was talking about how the Danites ended up taking the city of Laish and later renaming it to Dan, and the sinful nature of that, the extreme violence that was involved with that, the idolatry that was involved with that, and it was mainly going to explain why I suppose at the day it was written, why it was still such a terrible place even to that day. And that's one of the two major accounts that you're going to see at the end of Judges. And here's your fair warning, that's by far the more mild one. These last chapters of Judges are all going to be dealing essentially with one really big event, or at least one event and its consequences immediately afterwards. And it's worse, way worse. Got to warn you now, if you're sensitive towards violence, especially of a sexual nature, I got to warn you, this one really isn't for you. It's one of the very worst things that happens in the Bible. All right, let's go ahead and get into it. Judges chapter 19, beginning in verse 1. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Uh-oh. We remember that when we see that phrase, we know nothing good is going to come before it, or rather after it, probably before it too, but certainly not after it. A certain Levite was sojourning in the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim, who took to himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. And his concubine was unfaithful to him, and she went away from him to her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah, and there some 4 months. Then her husband arose and went after her to speak kindly to her and bring her back. He had with him his servant and a couple of donkeys, and she brought him into her father's house. And when the girl's father saw him, he came with joy to meet him. And his father-in-law, the girl's father, made him stay, and he remained with him 3 days. So they ate and drank and spent the night there. And on the fourth day they arose early in the morning, and he prepared to go. But the girl's father said to his son-in-law, "Strengthen your heart with a morsel of bread, and after that you may go." So the two of them sat and ate and drank together. And the girl's father said to the man, "Be pleased to spend the night, and let your heart be merry." And when the man rose up to go, his father-in-law pressed him till he spent the night there again. And on the fifth day he rose early in the morning to depart. And the girl's father said, "Strengthen your heart and wait until the day declines." So they ate, both of them. And when the man and his concubine and his servant rose up to depart, his father-in-law, the girl's father, said, "Behold, now the day is waned towards evening. Please spend the night. Behold, the day draws to its close. Lodge here, and let your heart be merry. And tomorrow you shall arise early in the morning, and for your journey, and go home." But the man would not spend the night. He rose up and departed, and arrived opposite Jebus, that is, Jerusalem. He had with him a couple of saddled donkeys, and his concubine with him. All right, let's pause there and explain what's going on. You start with a Levite. Interestingly enough, the last account had a Levite very prominent involved with it. Again, we have mentioning of a Levite. Now, this might partially be because it was expected that the Levites would be a particularly moral people among the Jews. You might remember that in the parable of the Good Samaritan that Jesus gave, he gave examples of two people who are held in high esteem, which did not act as a neighbor to their brother who had been robbed and left for dead. One was a priest and the other one was a Levite. It was supposed to be shocking that a Levite, of all people, would not act morally and help this person. Perhaps that's part of the reason it specifically mentions these Levites, because they're supposed to be the ones who are acting morally, but they don't. By the way, this also probably takes place very early in the book of Judges. Remember, this is not a chronological book. There's evidence to suggest that this account happens very early in the Judges period. For one, Phinehas, who was a contemporary of Moses, is mentioned in, I don't know if it was in this chapter or not, I've forgotten, but in the account he's mentioned. Furthermore, Josephus, who of course is an uninspired writer but is often handy for these sorts of things, he places this very close to the days of Joshua and just after Joshua's death, as a matter of fact. So it's very likely that this account happens around that time. All right. So, this Levite has a concubine. Problem number one. This is something that had me tearing my hair out when it came to the commentators, by the way. What I saw when people were writing commentary, they were treating this as if this is a man's interactions with his wife. A concubine is not a wife. A concubine is a completely unscriptural relationship that many people had, especially during the Old Testament, and they were never supposed to do that. Don't ever make the mistake of seeing concubine and think, well, that's basically okay, right? It's not. Concubine is just a way to treat a woman like a wife to gain the things that you want out of a wife without having to treat her in the way that God demands that a man treat a woman. So, concubine, not a good thing. If you see a commentator saying, well, she committed adultery and therefore she should have been stoned. No, she did not commit adultery. She committed fornication because she was not a wife. A concubine is just a nothing. It's just a name that's made up to try to justify this nonsense. By the way, if you do see a commentator suggesting that the Levite did not obey the Lord for not having her stoned, I'm not. Yes, it says in Leviticus that somebody who commits adultery ought to be stoned. That's true. I'm not convinced, however, that there was not room for a judge to be merciful in those cases. I think you see a couple of examples of people living despite the fact that they've committed adultery in the Old Testament, and God seems to approve of that situation. That tells me that a judge has the choice of allowing somebody to live despite committing this sin. David and Bathsheba are fantastic examples of that. Now, they still suffer pretty badly because of their sin, and somebody else who was unrelated to it also suffers, but they themselves do not. All right. Anyway, there's a fight between this man and his concubine. Apparently, she commits adultery. The fight gets so bad, she decides to go back home to her family. After a few months, the Levite decides that he wants to reconcile with her. So he saddles up a donkey, takes one of his servants with him, and he goes down to Bethlehem, very close to Jerusalem. He goes there, and his father-in-law apparently is very happy to see him. I guess he's happy that he won't have to continue supporting his daughter after these 4 months. I'm not really sure why he's so happy to see him. Maybe he thought of this as bringing honor back to his daughter. After all, she likely committed a fornication against him. Once again, this is not a wife, so I'm not going to use the term adultery, but she did probably. He's happy that there's some sort of honor probably being brought back to his household, and so they feast for about 3 days, and he keeps delaying him. He delays him a whole day. On when the Levite's got his concubine and his servant and his donkey ready, the father-in-law says, hey, why don't you just stay here for a little bit longer? It's first thing in the morning. You don't have to go yet. And then, during the evening, he's about to go. It's like, oh, it's too late for you to go. You gotta stay here and spend the night. And so he does. Next morning, fifth morning, he's about ready to go out. And he says, no, you don't have to go just yet. Why don't you stay here a while? Let's do some more partying. And then later, once again, he's about to do the same thing. But by the time it's evening, the Levite says, no, I really got to get going. And so he goes. There's not a lot of point to that whole account, I don't think, except this. It explains why the travel plans are apparently not there. They're not very well planned at all. And it's going to explain why the Levite is going to be in the situation that he is here in a little bit. So, the Levite, his servant, his donkey, and his concubine are all leaving. Now, they go to, they pass by Jebus, whatever you want to pronounce it, which was later renamed to Jerusalem. That makes sense. Of course, if you're familiar with the New Testament, you know that the city of Bethlehem, or the town of Bethlehem, very close to Jerusalem, so that, of course, makes sense. Um, it, it would have been a good place to lodge, except the Levite says, I don't want to go to that town. You might recall that although the Israelites did defeat the city of that Jerusalem at that time, Jebus, whatever, they let the Jebusites come right back. Of course, the Jebusites were supposed to be completely driven out of the land, but they come right back. And because of this, the Levite, self-righteously, I believe, ooh, goes right into our title. He self-righteously says, I'm not going to stay over there. I'm going to stay someplace where there are Israelites, because Israelites aren't like those Jebusites. They aren't evil. I'm going to stay with them. Now, of course, he's a pretty evil guy himself. He's already proven himself to be that. And if you don't believe that yet, just wait to see what he does later. But he figures, I'm going to just go a little bit further, and he's got a couple of options. So, verse 13. And he said to his young man, Come and let us draw near to one of these places and spend the night at Gibeah or Ramah. So they passed on their way, and the sun went down on them near Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin. And they turned aside to go in it and spend the night at Gibeah. And he went in and sat down in the open square of the city, for no one took them into his house to spend the night. So they stop at this Benjamite city, which Benjamite, of course, being one of the tribes of Israel, the Benjamites. He goes in, and he expects somebody to take him into his household. You might be wondering why that is. It appears that was a pretty common cultural thing. You don't really have inns, hotels, or anything, and so it was an expected courtesy that you would bring strangers into your household and, kind of pay it forward. Hopefully, sometime in the future, somebody else will pay attention to that courtesy if you happen to be traveling, and they'll bring you into their household. In addition, this is a Levite, and it was an expectation that people were supposed to treat Levites well because they weren't allowed to have their own land like the rest of the tribes, and so you were supposed to be very hospitable to the Levites. But nobody is, and so he waits and he goes to the town square or near the town gate, and he just sort of sits around waiting, thinking basically, surely somebody eventually is going to invite me in, and if not, I guess we'll just stay here in the town square. Verse 16. And behold, an old man was coming from his work in the field at evening. The man was from the hill country of Ephraim, and he was sojourning in Gibeah. The men of the place were Benjamites. And he lifted up his eyes and saw the traveler in the open square of the city. And the old man said, Where are you going? And where do you come from? Where do you come from? God Job. And he said to him, We are passing from Bethlehem in Judah to the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim, from which I come. I went to Bethlehem in Judah, and I'm going to the house of the Lord. But no one has taken me into his house. We have straw and feed for our donkeys, with bread and wine for me and your female servant, and the young man with your servants. There is no lack of anything. And the old man said, Peace be to you. I will care for all your wants, only do not spend the night in the square. So he brought him into his house, and gave the donkeys feed, and washed their feet, and they ate and drank. So, an old man who is not really from Gibeah. He is from Ephraim, which is also where the Levite happens to be from. He is staying temporarily in Gibeah, is the best I can make out of this. Apparently, he owns some property here, or perhaps he's renting. I don't really know, but he's here. He sees the Levite here, and he strikes up a conversation. Oh, you're from Ephraim as well. How about that? And he offers him to stay in his house. There is one little bit of ominousness here when he says, Please stay in my house, only do not stay the night in the square. Now, in this dry and arid environment, I don't think he was worried about the Levite being caught up in bad weather. And I think commentators are right when they compare this to some of our cities, right? Don't be at such and such a place after dark. Certainly, it would seem to pan out that way. But the Levite is going to go ahead and stay with this old man. Now, verse 22. As they were making their hearts merry, read getting drunk, by the way, behold, the men of the city, worthless fellows, surrounded the house, beating on the door, and they said to the old man, the master of the house, bring out the man who came into your house, that we may know him. Just so we understand what's going on here. The old man is there, they're getting drunk, and the men of the city start pounding on the door. Apparently, they were paying pretty close attention to the stranger among them. And they yell in, bring out the man in your house that we may know him. This is not them just wanting to get to know the guy better. When they say know him, they mean they want to rape him. So, what happens next? Verse 23. And the master of the house, went out to them and said to them, no, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Once again, there you go. There's nothing wicked by wanting to get to know somebody. This is euphemism. Since this man has come into my house, do not do this vile thing. So it starts out by, it seems like the old man is going to be a stand-up guy. He's going to stand up for this man and say, no, don't do this thing. And he's going to beg with the would-be sexual assaulters and say, don't do this. But then he does this. Verse 24. Behold, here are my virgin daughter and his concubine. Let me bring them out now. Violate them, and do with them what seems good to you, but against this man do not do this outrageous thing. So, while he seems like he's being brave at first, he then tries to make a deal with them. Don't do this to this man. Here, take my virgin daughter and this guy's concubine and do whatever you want to them. Just leave us alone. What a coward. What just complete anything you can think of to say about this guy. By the way, the Levites know better. He's allowing all of it to happen. Anything you can say about this guy, it's too good. There is no redeeming quality about this. I suppose he thought he was being redeeming by saving one man from being, assaulted in a homosexual matter. I think he somehow thought it would be better if it were heterosexual, as if that makes it rape any better. Well, of course not. It was just as evil either way. And it really goes to show where this person's head is at. I find nothing redeeming about this whatsoever. But the men would not listen to him. This is verse 25. So the man seized his concubine and made her go out to them. And they knew her and abused her all night until the morning. And as dawn began to break, they let her go. And as morning appeared, the woman came and fell down at the door of the man's house where her master was, until it was light. So, this girl, the man, the Levite, that is, not the old man, just in case you thought, well, he's really just being a bystander, that's not as bad as the old man. When the men refuse this offer because they are set on homosexual rape instead of heterosexual rape, the Levite grabs his concubine, opens the door, and throws her to the wolves, and shuts the door. I think, it's Josephus stating that at this point they grab her and take her back to one of their homes, and for the night they rape her. I don't know what the old man and the Levite do at this point. Something tells me they just kept getting drunk. The woman eventually is let go around dawn, and she crawls back to the house because this is where she sees some sort of safety, even though this person literally just threw her out to this. she sees some sort of safety. This is all she can think of. She makes it to the doorstep of the house and then dies. Vile doesn't even begin to cover the amount of evil that we're seeing here. Should be noted, there's a very similar situation which has already happened in the Bible. If we will, let's take a moment and go back to the book of Genesis where we see something similar. It's more, it's a little bit different, but it starts off in a very similar way. Genesis chapter 19, beginning in verse 1. The two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed himself with his face to the earth and said, My lords, please turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise up and go on your way. They said, No, we will spend the night in the town square. But he pressed them strongly, so they turned aside to him and entered the house. And he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. Genesis chapter 19 follows two angels that had been sent to the city of Sodom. And they are met by Lot, a righteous man in Sodom, and there are not really any others as far as we can tell in that city. And he sees them in the square and invites them to his house. They say, now we'll just stay in the square. And he presses them, probably for a very similar reason. Verse 4, But before they all lay down, the men of the city of Sodom, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man surrounded the house, and they came to Lot. Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may know them. Very similar, right? All the people of Sodom come around to the house of Lot. Bring out these men that we may know them. Lot went out to the men at the entrance, shut the door after him, and said, I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Behold, I have two daughters who have not known any man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof. So many similarities. The men of Sodom are set on homosexual rape here. Seeing these two men, they apparently were looking at them in the town square, and seeing that Lot had taken them into their house, they demand that these two men be brought out. And Lot is just as much of a coward as this old man and Levite were, however many hundred years later. And he says, I have these two virgin daughters. Why don't you take them instead? I'd like to take a moment, by the way, to show just how little value for women these people have. It's disgusting, completely unbiblical. And it probably helps to explain the actions of Lot's daughters later on. They are going to survive this, unlike the Levite's concubine. But this might help you understand why they do such depraved things themselves. It's because they have no sense of value of self. How can you when your own father is trying to throw you to the wolves? But in the same way, the homosexuals of Sodom are not going to accept this in the same way that they're not going to accept that at Gibeah. And so, verse 8, Behold, I have two daughters who have not known any man. Let me bring them to you, and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof. But they said, Stand back. And they said, This fellow came to sojourn, and he has become the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them. Then they pressed hard against the man Lot, and drew near to break the door down. But the men reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the entrance of the house, both small and great. So they wore themselves out, groping for the door. They become so angry at Lot that they start threatening him as well. Who are you to be the judge over us? Is what they say. Well, a very similar thing happens at Gibeah. The only difference is there's no angels to strike the men blind here, and they don't give up. God also is not going to deal with Gibeah in the same way that he dealt with Sodom, which of course was its complete and utter destruction, though Gibeah is not going to get out of this scot-free, don't worry. going back over to Gibeah, this poor girl dies right at the doorstep. Verse 27. And her master rose up in the morning, and he opened the doors of the house and went out to go on his way. Behold, there was his concubine lying at the door of the house with her hands on the threshold. He said to her, Get up, let us be going. But there was no answer. Then he put her on the donkey, and the man rose up and went away to his home. So she's dead. And this, I don't have any polite things to call the man, so I will call him nothing at all. He has a nerve to essentially kick her and say, Come on, let's get going. Of course, she's dead. I suppose it's a mercy that she was spared that of knowing about that indignity. So he puts her on his donkey and goes home. And when he entered his house, he took a knife, and taking hold of his concubine, he divided her limb by limb into 12 pieces, and sent her throughout all the territories of Israel. And all who saw it said, Such a thing has never happened or been seen from the day that the people of Israel came out from the land of Egypt until this day. Consider it, take counsel, and speak. Now, here's where I have to give some credit to this terrible man. He knew how to get people's attention. He did it in a pretty awful way. He quartered his own concubine. He took pieces of her, divided her into 12 pieces, and sent them to each tribe of Israel. Now, why do I say that there was anything good about that? Well, nothing morally good, but intelligent, I have to admit. I'll tell you what, he knew how to get people's attention, and that's exactly what he does. And that was the point of it, by the way. I'm going to get everybody's attention. You better believe that if some girl's, right hand shows up at your village, you're going to be paying attention to that. Your first thought's probably, we need to kill whoever did that, and that'd be a just thought, honestly. But he's doing this so he gets people's attention, and then he can explain why he has done this. This is not over yet, and there's going to be a lot of violence as a result of this incident. If you stuck with me this far, thank you. Not that I blame you if you didn't want to really study too far into this. It's pretty hard to listen to. I'm not going to tell you that the next couple of chapters of Judges are a whole lot better, although I'm of the opinion it doesn't get much worse than this. I think this is the worst thing that happens. Other bad things are going to happen, though, as we'll see. But I don't want to leave you in such a dour mood. Part of the point of this, of course, is that it was completely unacceptable. And unfortunately, these sorts of things do happen. I think there's a reason you see so much parallel between Sodom and Gibeah here. I think part of it is because sin tends to go through certain trends. And people's influences tend to influence sin in a certain way. In one way, sin never changes whatsoever. But the way it's committed seems to change a little bit over time. And the MO changes might be a good way to put it. The fact that the people of Gibeah are using Sodom's MO seems to indicate that they were very influenced by the Canaanites. Sodom and Gomorrah, by the way, were both culturally Canaanite. And so it seems that this was a pretty common thing for the Canaanites to do. And now it's infected the people of Israel. But the point of this is this needs to be rectified. And we'll be seeing that rectification in the next chapter. I hope you study with me next week, and Lord willing, we'll be able to get to that. Until then, love you all. Hope to see you soon.